What's up, movie lovers? I'm Mike, and this is Gotta Love Them Movies. Oh, you guys, welcome back to another edition of Gotta Love Them Movies. I'm your host, Mike Brown. I'm here all the time. Thanks for taking a little bit of time out of your busy day, out of your busy schedules, to come and hang out with us for an hour, hour and a half, or, for a few minutes, however long it is that you want to stick around. Today, we're talking all things movies, but specifically today, we're talking all things horror movies. If you know anything about me, you know that this is scary. I don't do horror movies. So if there's any kind of a comment or anything you want to talk about, jump down to the comment section below and leave us your thoughts. We've got here's the thing, you guys. Here's the thing. On today's show, I'm going to do one of these. I'm just going to pat myself on the back because here at Gotta Love Them Movies, we are in a very fortunate position to have one of the I'm going to go ahead and call you one of the masters of horror. We have a man who's worked in the industry. He's a horror movie professional. He's a horror movie aficionado. I could probably sit here and talk about all the wonderful, great things about him, but I will let him introduce himself. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for a very good friend of mine, Mr. Ron Harvey. Woo, woo, woo.
Thank you very much. Thank
Ron,
you.
how's it?
So,
yeah.
I guess you want me to introduce myself, so I can, I suppose. As far as being an expert on horror, I taught high school for a number of years, and I taught a course called History in the Horror Film, which was kind of my own way of taking horror films and merging them with history, culture, sociology, race, economics, government, all of those disparate elements, and kind of joining them together under what I feel like is the most important genre of film when it comes to talking about society, and that's horror films. And it was really fun because I was a high school teacher, and I got to basically introduce high school kids to horror movies, which is something that already just fits perfectly.
So cool.
But the cool thing about that was I was able to take these kids and say, here's a thing that you love, and it's important. In fact, not only is it important, it might be the most important genre of film when it comes to talking about history, when it comes to talking about society. That these things that you love that you think are frivolous or other people might look at and say are just kind of this fringe thing that we put over here actually have the most to say. More than any other film genre, I think, which is kind of cool.
Well, that's kind of
So I have a bachelor's degree in film production, but I kind of went in a different direction, became an artist, worked as an artist for a long time, taught high school for a long time, did a variety of different things, and now I take X-rays and talk about movies.
But I mean, that's kind of a hallmark of humanity, isn't it? That anything that is like of a lot of importance and needs to be talked about and analyzed and looked at and scrutinized a little bit, we like to kind of take those things and like put them in the corner and just kind of forget about them a little bit. It's because they're hard conversations to have. They're hard conversations to have, and even more than that, it's, as you point out, like they make real change and real impact. And anytime that you have a real change or real impact means that people actually have to do the hard work and change and accept something that is outside of their realm of normalcy.
Right. And in a lot of ways, the horror film is kind of like the nerdy kid that gets picked on all through high school and then becomes a tech billionaire later. It's one of those things that gets its respect as it goes on. Stephen King was asked in an interview a while back, about the fact that his early books were really panned by the critics. And the interviewer wanted to know, well, what do the critics think of them now? What do those same critics have to say now that you're a huge success, now that you're very well respected? And he said, well, in that time, I was really in my late teens, early 20s. So all those critics are dead. So sometimes it just comes down to outlasting the opposition,
That's true. That's just, you just got to stick around sometimes. Just got to stick around sometimes. Yeah. All right, guys. Well, we've got a lot of things to talk about today. Like I said, today's show is all horror movie themed, and we've kind of got it broken down. It's going to be a little bit of a different show today, but the same things of what you've always come to see. I'm going to tell you how to subscribe to the YouTube channel, and of course, as I click on the button, oh man, this bear with me. These are the problems of having a live show, you guys. Sometimes things don't happen the way that you'd like. Okay, well, there you go. Go over to youtube.com and type in GottaLoveThemMovies. You're going to see a little red button in the top right-hand corner that says subscribe. Go ahead and click that button. What clicking the subscribe button does is it helps to build our subscriber base. But Mike, you say... And of course, oh man, you guys, I'm so sorry. Can I just click this refresh button? Let's see what happens. There we go. But Mike, you say, we're watching this show on Facebook Live right now. Why do we have to go to YouTube? Well, here's the thing, you guys. Once we get enough subscribers, then I can start earning ad revenue. And once I start earning ad revenue, I get to make the show my full-time job. So I'd very much appreciate if you go over to youtube.com, type in Gotta Love Them Movies, and click that red subscribe button. And of course, as soon as we get 1,000 subscribers, this show will be moving from Facebook to YouTube. So just a little something to keep on the lookout there. All right, guys, so with all that down and out of the way, now it's time to talk horror movies. It's time to talk some horror movies. Now, guys, as we kind of break this down, we're going to go into different segments. We're going to break down the entire horror genre by like what age they were in. We'll talk about that in a second. Actually, you know what? Let's. Oh no! Did I change this whole thing? Oh, you guys, I changed this whole thing. I had this all perfectly figured out. And once you start meddling with things at the last minute, anyway, okay, so let's go with this. So here's some of the questions that we're going to try and answer today. What is horror? What is a horror movie? Not just what is a horror movie, but what is horror? Also, what's the difference between a scary movie and a horror movie? Because I contend they're two very, very different things. What draws us to these kinds of movies? Like what's that sick passion inside that we want to see people dismembered and in like these horrible, horrible situations? Also, is there a quote master of horror? Like what does that mean? And lastly, is there such a thing as the quintessential horror movie? Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I don't know. Let's we're going to get into it and talk about it. Now, as I said before, we're going to break all these things down. We're going to go from the golden age of horror. We're going to talk about the silver age of horror. We're going to talk about the bronze age of horror. We're going to talk about the current climate today when it comes to horror films. And also, and lastly, what is the future of these horror films? Ron? We have a lot to talk about. We have a lot to break down. So let's just, start right off the top and kick it right from the golden age of horror films. As I understand it, now you're the aficionado, you're the expert, you're the ones who's actually taught classes on this. I'm not a huge fan of the horror movie genre myself, but when it comes to the birth of horror films, how did this whole thing start?
Well, we've got to go further than just calling it film. You've got campfire stories that go back tens of thousands of years. You've got these masks on the wall behind me that all represent monsters, demons, spirits. The horror story is as old as stories themselves. The very earliest stories, if you look at the Odyssey, the Odyssey has horror elements in it. And, the oldest story is the Epic of Gilgamesh, is a horror story about a disaster that creates a tremendous flood. It's how we process emotions. And if you look, a really good example is in the last few months when coronavirus started, when we just started our lockdown, the two most downloaded, watched, viewed, requested, and rated movies at that time were Outbreak and Contagion.
Oh, yes. I remember this well.
And you would think that during a global pandemic, the last thing you would want to do is seek out a movie about what you're living through. But I think people go to those things and go, okay, well, what did the hero of this movie do in this situation? Because I don't know what I would do in that situation. You go, oh yeah, he did this. Oh, that was smart. You know, you watch for the people that are doing the smart things, and you make fun of the people that do the stupid things. And what's interesting to me is, as we've seen in the last few months, all the times we watch a horror movie and go, nobody would do that. That's idiotic. Nobody would do something that stupid. But seen nothing but people doing incredibly stupid things when you have a very obvious solution.
You know, there's a commercial
so,
that's it's kind of playing on like Hulu commercials or something like that right now.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those I think it's a Geico commercial actually. The premise is like this whole gang of people are, you know, they're being chased by the madman with a chainsaw, and the one girl says, "Hey, look, let's all jump over into that car that has keys in it and it's running so we can get away." And everyone's like, "What? You're crazy. Let's go into that shack full of knives and chains and it's dark and we have no idea." Yeah, that seems like a good idea. And so they rush.
Let's split up in the graveyard.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, split up in the graveyard. It's that whole thing. Yeah, totally. To your point.
Yeah. So it helps us process and deal with how we would respond to given situations, and it gives us guideposts of like what worked and what didn't. You know, for me, I'm a movie nut, so everything that happens to me in my life, I relate to a movie. Like anything that goes on, a movie pops into my head and a scene pops into my head, and I apply it, and that's kind of how I process it. So movies are in effect an extension of just regular campfire stories that are just being told to you. And my favorite thing about movies is that for 2 hours, I get to sit in the dark and have somebody else tell me a story, and I don't have to do anything. I'm not responsible for anything. I don't have to make decisions. I get to watch other people make decisions, and that's a good lesson. But you were asking how the horror movie starts.
Yeah.
So around the beginning of the 20th century, we have the birth of film, and some of the very first examples of film are horror stories. You've got The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, you've got The Golem, you've got Nosferatu. All of those happen in the 1920s. And you can argue that the very first film, which is The Great Train Robbery, which is a super cool film if you've never seen it, silent film,
just this
opens.
You're talking about The Great Train Robbery?
The train right at you.
Gotcha. Yep.
Coming right at you, and ends with a gunslinger taking a gun, pointing it right at the camera, and firing it, which scared the crap out of people the first time they saw it. They were ducking under their seats. They were trying to get out of the way.
Yeah.
So that scare, both of those were essentially jump scares. And that kind of clued, I think, a lot of directors into the visceral power of a moving image. So the first films you have, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu, you've got Phantom of the Opera, you've got The Hunchback of Notre Dame. What do those all have in common? Disfigurement, right? So you go back to the 1920s. What happened just prior to the 1920s? You had you had World War I, the European War. So you have, for the first time, thanks to big new medical advances, you have people that go to the battlefield. They go far away. You know, they go halfway across the world. You have no contact with them, and they come back disfigured, because medical science has advanced to a stage that you can keep people alive even if they're badly injured. So you get your face blown off, you come back with half a face. And they actually made porcelain masks that would cover up these faces, just like the Phantom of the Opera. So you would have people coming back that you didn't know, somebody familiar that was somehow still a monster. And you had these people kind of walking around in organized society. How do you process that? How do you deal with that? So you find the humanity in these disfigured people. And in the case of Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, in the case of Phantom of the Opera, in the case of Hunchback of Notre Dame, those disfigured people are all the heroes. They're all the heroes of the stories. They're the ones you relate to. So you begin to see the humanity in people like that. And that's kind of where it comes from. It comes from World War I, essentially. So
now, in terms of like some more of like the cinematic filmmaking, when I was doing a tiny itty bitty little bit of research here, I was looking up what are the earliest examples of horror films and like quintessential, I guess, quintessential horror films and whatever. One of the films that I came across was it was made by one of my favorite directors of all time, George Méliès, in 1896. And I mean,
Yeah.
we often think of like, ooh, the silent film age being like the 1920s and 1930s, but I mean, the silent movie era really started in the 1800s.
Yes.
And I slapped together. Well, I didn't slap together. I put music on top of it. But in a few minutes, or in just a moment, I want to play one of George Méliès's earliest films called. It goes by two different names. I'm not sure if you can help me on this. It's either House of the Devil or The Devil's Castle. It kind of, as what I could see,
Yeah.
kind of went by two different names. It's only
Yeah.
3 minutes long. If you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and play it now. But this is the earliest, quote unquote, example of one of the earliest horror films ever made. Go ahead and check it out. Okay, so that is the House of the Devil, or the Devil's Castle, kind of however you wanna think of it, or refer to it as. Kind of goes by two different names. George Méliès being one of my favorite filmmakers of all time. He very famously did A Trip to the Moon, where a whole bunch of explorers go off to the moon. And what makes George Méliès, in my opinion, so brilliant as a filmmaker were his cutting edge special effects. I mean, we look at the special effects in a movie like this, The House of the Devil, and it seems very rudimentary. But at the time, when visual storytelling was not a thing, he was able to cut pieces of film together to make it actually look like things are disappearing and then reappearing. And he did that like the whole time throughout the film. You know, the devil, or I guess the man in black, if we're calling him the devil, he kept disappearing and then reappearing. There was a cauldron. He conjured kind of all these witch creatures. They disappeared. They reappeared. It was just a reoccurring theme. So with the emergence of visual storytelling comes the opportunity for special effects. And then we really get into the heart of some of this stuff. So, Ron, I will pitch it back to you when it comes to like the filmmaking side of things. And like, where does... Because I think when you ask your kind of stereotypical, like standard person on the street, what's the earliest horror film you can think of? I think a lot of people would say Dracula, you know, with Bela Lugosi. I don't know if that's fair, but that just kind of seems in the social consciousness.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And there was a big resurgence in the 1930s of kind of fairy tale horror, and there was also this was at the end of the Roaring Twenties, so you had a booming economy at the end of it. Had a lot of interest in new religions, mysticism, seances, magical things, and world travel was also becoming a thing. So you had people coming from ancient lands, coming from far away, bringing cool artifacts and what might come with it. 1922, you had the discovery of King Tut's tomb, which not only created...
Interesting. I didn't realize that was in 22.
Yeah, that created not only the boom and interest in kind of foreign lands, archaeology, and that kind of mysticism, but it also created the Art Deco movement. So it changed art as well, and that continues to evolve through the 1930s. You know, there's always some lag time between an event happening and the popularizing of the culture around it, because at the time it took a lot longer for that type of stuff to spread. Now, somebody says something on TV and the next day it's a T-shirt. It's like
True.
Halfway across the world. But there was a very strong interest in that in the 1930s. You have movies like King Kong, where they actually go to a faraway island when there still were mysterious islands, bring King Kong back, and that collision of ideas. There's mad science. There's these huge technological leaps that are happening. And then you've also need that escapism because you've got the Great Depression. So you need something to get you away from what you're stuck in.
Considering the time we have, I'm going to challenge you maybe just a little bit for the sake of conversation. In the late let's see, I'm getting my dates mixed up. So 1939, we have movies, escapism type stuff like The Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind won Best Picture that year. But surrounding all around in that era, we have films like, like I said, Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy Returns, The Invisible Man. Creature from the Black Lagoon was a little bit more 50s. If memory serves correct. But, we have a blending of these two genres. If people are looking for more escapism, a little bit more fantasy, what is it that draws them, like a 1930s crowd? Why did they go see Dracula and not Wizard of Oz? I mean, I understand they were separated by, 8 years? But, in the spirit of the question, why do they go...
And the technological leap from Dracula to Wizard of Oz is massive.
Huge.
It's absolutely
huge.
Enormous. It's really a quantum leap, because you've got something that's barely like early sound, and then you've got Wizard of Oz, which is Technicolor and massive scale, and
it's a musical. It's a full-on musical.
But if you ask just about anybody, what freaked you out as a kid? Like, what movie did you see that really messed you up? I'm willing to bet that 1 in 10 of those people will say The Flying Monkeys from Wizard of Oz.
That is my mother. I say that without hesitation. that is the reason that my mother does not. In fact, I don't know if you saw on the channel, but last week or 2 weeks ago, I did a review of The Wizard of Oz just for my mother. She wanted to know what my thoughts on it were, as it being a classic film, but it was The Flying Monkeys that freaked her out.
Yeah, yeah, worse than just about anything. And you can ask that of people who are only 20 years old, and they'll say the Wizard of Oz, which is
Yeah.
really cool. That it's, it's what is it? It's 90 years old now. No, it's 80.
39. So, yeah, 80 years old. 81?
Yeah, it's pretty cool that something like that can have an effect. I remember showing Nosferatu to teenagers and it freaking them out. That's a
Yeah.
disturbing film. And what disturbs us, you think, well, modern horror movies are much scarier, and not necessarily. The rules of suspense and horror are pretty much the same. They stay the same throughout. So, um, but it's interesting because almost all of those films from the 1930s deal with fantasy. Faraway lands, going far away, coming back, going far away, coming back,
So,
or bringing something back or going somewhere
So I
far
can
away,
see the
like
appeal
that.
of like this faraway land, something I've never seen before. It's grand,
Right.
Romania or at the time Transylvania. I get it. Like I get that aspect of why people would be drawn to that. But again, like what is it about the 1930s films? And we're gonna go through ask this question for each age of film, but what is it about the 1930s horror films, I guess as we're affectionately referring to as the golden age? What was the horror aspects? Like there was disfigurement, there was dismemberment, um,
Mhm.
Phantom of the Opera, classic example of that, but it was a lot of the themes were of people, yes, being transfigured a little bit,
Mhm.
but also being taken. Dracula, classic
Yeah,
story of being kidnapped.
the woman and haul her off. Yeah.
Um, Same thing
Yeah.
with Frankenstein. Like everybody was afraid that he was like there was the little girl. It was very extremely suspenseful, and eventually he threw her in the river. Um,
Mhm.
People disappearing, the Invisible Man, people disappearing.
Mhm.
Same thing with the
Right.
Mummy, and all this stuff. So what is it? What was it about the culture at the time that made people want to like experience like? Okay, cool. You're gonna go see a land far away and these, ancient cultures that you just aren't really exposed to. But there's a scare factor there. There was the flying monkey. The flying monkeys terrified everybody. But what is it like in the culture in the social consciousness that people want to at the time very disturbingly want to be exposed to that?
So it's interesting because Steinbeck wrote about this a lot during the Great Depression. That you have you have what he called the temporarily embarrassed millionaires, who were the people that would support the patriarchy despite their best
Yeah.
interests. So you have, I mean, imagine you put yourself in the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma, you know, and the tent comes to town with a bunch of guys running a projector, and you can get out of your dirty, filthy, dusty life and go live in another place. You can go voyage to other land, and not only that, but you get to see a movie where the bad guys get what's coming
Mm.
to them, or they get punished, or they get there's some sort of form
That's
of
true. That
justice
is true.
for the under. There's the 1932 film Freaks, which if you haven't seen it, it's
Todd
awesome,
Browning.
awesome.
Todd Browning.
And that's about the underdogs getting justice. Basically, it's the people who were always laughed at finally getting to rise up and conquer. And that's what a depressed society looks toward, is like, how do we justify ourselves? How can we rise above? How can we become the victor? And for an hour and a half in a movie theater, they can become a part of that story where they're finally succeeding, finally winning, which all changes once World War II hits. Not only that, but you have an almost complete lack of horror films in the
Sure, yeah.
1940s because the entire Hollywood system turned its energy toward making propaganda films and
Yeah.
pro war films and things like that. So you have a very limited series of movies. You have movies like The Wolfman, which is about a man who changes into a wolf, and if the wolf is an allegory for Germany, is an allegory for the Nazi system, the Nazi party, then you have the capacity of someone to, without their control, become the enemy, become something they're not,
Interesting.
become changed, become dangerous. That's your
Well,
fascist
World War
threat.
II didn't create the idea of the Wolfman or changing from one thing or another. So it's interesting to me that
Right.
that symbology would be used in such a way to say, like, this is a danger. This is something to be aware of. Which brings
Yeah.
up a great question. What is it about horror movies? Like, how have these early horror films, and we're going to transition from the golden age into the silver age. In fact, let's do that now. Well, this is the horror films, the Silver Age. Now consider yourself transitioned. Okay, great. That was a terrible bit. So terrible
That's
bit.
awesome.
Um, so like transitioning from the 30s and in the early 40s into the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, which I think we can, kind of affectionately refer to as the Silver Age of horror. Um, a lot of, even in the golden age, there were a lot of films that taught us morality, and I feel like that just kind of amped up more in the silver age of films as storytelling became more important, and it relied less on visuals and more of kind of the theme, but like really delving deep into character a little bit. How did we learn morals from the silver age of films as opposed to the golden age?
Well, this is interesting because after World War II, America goes through a massive transition. We suddenly come out of this with not only a booming economy, but you have all of these people who went away to war and became engineers, mathematicians, scientists, and now they're set loose on the country and they're putting that new tech to work. With the end of World War II, you have a rise of the Soviet Union. So you've got the threat of communism that follows on the coattails of World War II. So you have a boom in interest in technology, and science can solve anything, but you also have a threat of science. Science is a threat of changing things. So I really like the 1950s because you have two films that were made in the same year. You have The Thing from Another World, and you have, of course, I flat out blank on it right now and have to look it up.
Sorry, as you're
Excuse me,
as you're
while
doing that, I'm currently looking for a photo of thing from another world.
oh
So
yeah,
here's
well
just kind of a
the inspiration for, of course,
John Carpenter's The
the
Thing. Yeah.
thing, which is a quintessential horror film, maybe not the quintessential horror film, but a quintessential horror film. And let's see.
Okay, so what?
It's a film where the guy comes from outer space with Gort. Why am I blanking on the name? It's because I'm in the horror mindset, not the sci-fi mindset. He comes down, lands in Washington D.C. with
Oh,
the solar. Gort comes.
uh, yeah, remade with Keanu Reeves in the '90s. Um,
Yes, unfortunately.
wow, I can perfectly see this in my mind.
Isn't that stupid that I'm
I know
blanking on this right
exactly what you're
now?
talking about. Oh man, if anybody's watching this,
Day the Earth Stood Still. The Day the Earth Stood
that's the
Still.
one. Day the Earth Stood Still.
Oh, that's super
Woof.
embarrassing. Okay, so you've got in 1951, you have The Day the Earth Stood Still, and you have The Thing from Another
Yeah.
World. Okay. So the day the Earth stood still, the guy comes from outer space. He doesn't want to talk to the military. He doesn't want to talk to the world leaders. What he wants to do is talk to the scientists. And he says, you guys need to figure this thing out because your military has gone nuts. They've completely turned into this megalomaniacal military industrial complex, and they're going to destroy the world. But not only that, they're going to start turning their guns into outer space. And as soon as they point them at us, we've got a problem and we're going to wipe you out. Right. So the film, despite all the military might, puts its trust in the scientists to become the peacekeepers. The Thing from Another World does the exact opposite. In that film, you've got the thing that lands and winds up in the ice. They dig it out of the ice and it starts to transform. It doesn't do what it does in John Carpenter's The Thing, which is take on the form of other people. But what it does do is start eating everybody and cannibalizing them and destroying them. And it's this soulless monster. But all the scientists want to study it, and all the military guys are not like, no, we need to just kill it. That's the best thing to do. And so that treats the scientists as guys that are more interested in intellect and the pursuit of knowledge than preserving the human species, essentially. And they're both tackling the same idea, an outside threat. One relies on science, one relies on military might. So you've got those two perspectives kind of duking it out in the 1950s. You've got sci-fi horror films like Them, where all this pursuit of nuclear technology has created these mutant monsters that come and destroy people. And then across the ocean, you've got Japan dealing with its scars from the atomic bomb attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which becomes Godzilla. That's Godzilla is essentially a metaphor for the destruction that the Japanese suffered at the end of World War II. So you have those things as well.
The first Godzilla film was what, 59?
It was 54.
Okay.
And it's an honest-to-God horror film.
Yeah.
It's a dread. Mm-hmm. It's a very serious film. It's not campy like a lot of the later on.
Well,
Godzilla
that brings
movies.
up an interesting philosophical question, because what's the difference between a scary movie and a horror film?
It's sometimes a thin line.
Yeah.
One of the things I really enjoy is when I see a director that started in horror, like say you have somebody like Sam Raimi or Peter Jackson, and they go on to make other movies. But in those movies, you have horror elements which are far scarier than most other films because they cut their teeth on making horror films. A good example, the things that are scary in the Lord of the Rings series, like Shelob's Lair, only a horror film director could do that. Only somebody who really deeply understands it can pull that sort of thing off. And you've got Sam Raimi making the Spider-Man films, but you have scenes like the scene where Dr. Octopus escapes from the hospital, which is a straight-up Evil Dead style horror.
Sure is. Yeah, it was. Right. And if you're not familiar with Sam Raimi's style of filmmaking, that scene, which at the time when I saw it, I was not familiar with Sam Raimi at all, and that scene was very jarring. Because it's not, it doesn't really gel with the rest of the film. Because the rest of the movie is just a very beautiful, very elegant, very heroic kind of movie. And then you see that one scene, and you're like, why? And it's
but you really see what he's capable of,
shocking,
right?
and it's fun, and it was fun.
Yeah. Yes. The splat stick is what I call it.
So.
And what it's often called.
Earlier, I mentioned the idea of what's the difference between horror and scary. In my experience,
I'd like to know what you think it is. Because
in my experience, because I love the idea, I love the concept of horror films, right? I think they're fun. I think they're entertaining. I think they can be fun, depending on, like you said, like sometimes there's a fine line, right? I definitely think that there is an idea of instilling fear into the audience, and I would call that a scary movie. Jurassic Park, my favorite movie of all time, hands down. I contend it's a horror film. It's a monster movie. People are, trapped, being chased by things that they don't understand, things that they can't really contend with face to face, because if they do, the dinosaurs will eat their heads off. So things that they just desperately need to get away from, but they're put into these circumstances and they can't. I contend that is a horror movie. Contagion, as you talked about before, that's a horror movie. And there are horror movies that are kid friendly, Paranorman, Hocus Pocus. There's a handful of horror films that are kind of kid friendly in a way. And
Coraline,
that's really creepy. Just
such a disturbing movie.
It's really good. I like it a lot. But scary, there's something about a film, and earlier you talked about like Sam Raimi and Peter Jackson, and I maybe even put Steven Spielberg into the mix. There's a certain type of filmmaker that wants to evoke emotion. You know, like as a comedian, I want people to feel whatever kind of an emotion it is that, you know, I'm putting out there. If I'm doing comedy, I want you to laugh. If I'm doing drama, I want you to cry, or at least like feel what it is that I as an actor am feeling, right? But as a horror director or a scary movie director, I think that their purpose, they specifically want the audience to feel scared. They want them to feel fear. Stephen King, masterful at that in writing books, and I would even contend that the new It movie, scariest movie I've ever seen in my life, hands down. Period. I couldn't sleep for 4 months. I slept.
It's a classic. I love that.
Scared me
I love
to
that film.
death. But you know, the audiences had the same reaction when Psycho came out. Audiences had the same reaction when you know, Frankenstein came out. Audiences had the same reaction when Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and you know, we'll get into kind of the more those films in a minute. But there's something about scary movies that tries to infuse fear into the viewer, and I'm one of those people that I think it's also dependent on the viewer as well, because not everybody experiences the same movie the same way, right? So the way that I view film and visual storytelling is I put myself in the place of the hero. Whoever the hero is, whoever the main character is, whatever. I'm excited for Captain America to save the day. I'm excited for Frodo to throw the ring into Mount Doom. I'm excited for I can't think of any of the heroes' names in the movie It, but whatever. I'm excited for the Losers Club. I'm excited for the Losers Club to defeat Pennywise. And so I emotionally put myself in the place of those characters. And I think that's why I love fandom so much. I love Star Wars because I emotionally see myself as Luke Skywalker. I emotionally see myself as who's behind me? Captain America, Guillermo del Toro. Who's over here? Star Wars, Wonder Woman, X-Men, Ninja Turtles. I see myself as these characters, and I make an emotional relationship with the on-screen characters. And if the on-screen character is sad, well, then I'm sad. And if the on-screen character is terrified, guess what? So I think it's a two-part.
You wrap yourself into it.
Yeah, I think it's a two-part.
So I think that rather than fear, I use the word dread, because a movie that really establishes dread really works. I think that the film, Guillermo del Toro's film Crimson Peak, did a wonderful job of establishing dread. Because
never seen it, but it looks like the kind of movie that I want to see, but I know I won't be able to handle it.
It's just wonderful. It really is, and Guillermo del Toro and Peter Jackson make just the best ghosts ever. Like, their ghosts are like leagues beyond anybody else's ghosts. They're so good. But you know, in those films, of course, in all of Guillermo del Toro's movies, he wants you to relate to the monster. And you start out thinking that this is about somebody else, but generally the story usually winds up being about the monster, the misunderstood monster. And that makes a lot of sense, because a lot of his favorite movies are movies like Frankenstein and The Mummy and King Kong. He loves King Kong. You know, so Ray Harryhausen is one that both Del Toro and Peter Jackson followed the three monster rules. So the three monster rules is a monster is concerned with really three things: food, shelter, and family. And if you make a monster and you make them concerned with those three things, that's all the motivation they need. They want shelter, they want food, and they want to protect their family. And then at that point, you have a monster that will be scary, but you can also empathize with. And Ray Harryhausen was brilliant at that. With every monster he created, he put personality into it. You know, he put motivation behind those. And that's what was so cool about Jurassic Park, because it was the very first movie to really make dinosaurs scary. And that was very true of Michael Crichton's book too. When I read that book, I was blown away, because it had never occurred to me that dinosaurs were scary. Like, it just never crossed my mind.
No.
But of course they are. They're freaking terrifying.
They're terrifying.
You know, what what if there's really nothing you could do, So
So if we,
before they just kind of lunched around like this, and they would strike at you and you poke at it with sticks, but it wouldn't get any closer. But these things are fast.
well,
They're
like you were saying with King Kong, going back to King Kong, the stop motion, that was our only real like on screen depiction of dinosaurs. Was like these little things that kind of go around, they eat plants, and maybe they fight with each other, but man, they're fine. You're like, nah, you can't really see yourself in them. But
there's a fantasy aspect of it that allows you to separate yourself from what they are.
yeah.
You can say, well, that's special effect. Jurassic Park was the first movie where you go, I don't know how they did that. Like when I watched that T-Rex scene for the first time in the theater, I had no idea how they did it. And I was in film school at the time. I was studying visual effects work. I couldn't figure it out. I was like, as far as I know, that's a real dinosaur. That's as far as I can guess. I think they got a real dinosaur and they put it in a movie, and that's what happened.
So going back to the Silver Age of horror films, what is it about the Silver Age of horror films that was a reflection of the times? And when I think of the Silver Age, I think of Psycho. I think of Night of the Living Dead. We see the emergence of zombies. Like zombies kind of became a very popular thing at the time. We see a lot of pulp fiction happening.
Mm-hmm. So Night of the Living Dead, if you're going to say, pick one of any of the horror films, pick one.
Hey, Ron, if you can only pick one of the horror films, and I'm not even going to give a qualifier, but if you can only pick one of the horror films, what do you pick?
Night of the Living Dead.
Oh, interesting.
You can write a book on it. So Night of the Living Dead was made in 1968. What was happening in 1968?
Civil rights movement.
Civil rights movement. You've got Vietnam. You've got women's rights movement, right? So those are the things that are kind of pulling people apart. And now you look back on it and go, well, there was a civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King did a march, and now black people can do stuff. And oh yeah, the women's rights movement. Well, they wanted some rights and they got some rights, and everybody was cool with that. And they don't take into account the turbulent conflict. And I don't think until maybe this year can we truly understand how people can be so bitterly divided on something. But there were just as many people fighting against the civil rights movement, against women's rights, and for the Vietnam Wars. There were people fighting against it.
Sure.
So what Night of the Living Dead does is it puts a big fat magnifying glass on that. And if you just watch the Night of the Living Dead as a zombie film, which I did when I was a kid, you go, that was pretty cool, pretty scary zombie film. And essentially it's the first of the modern zombie films. It's the first where zombies eat people and lumber around and eat brains and do all the things that zombies do.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but that was the first time we actually saw a human being chewing on what we perceive to be human flesh. Correct?
I believe so.
Shocking.
And
Shocking.
It was a low budget film shot in black and white on 16 millimeter, and it made it big. It was kind of the first Blair Witch Project, where this thing that probably wasn't supposed to be a big hit became a huge hit.
Right.
Why did it become a huge hit? Because it just pinned that zeitgeist right to the wall. It struck a nerve. Even if people didn't know what it was about, that's what it's about. And George Romero says, I was just trying to make a scary zombie movie. I wasn't trying to make a cultural commentary. But it is the thickest, densest, strongest cultural commentary I've ever seen. So you've got the hero of the film, who's a young black man, right?
Yep.
And you've got the
unintentional casting, by the way. Unintentional casting.
Right.
It just happened that way.
You accidentally create a magnificent allegory just because the universe is just tuned in, and that's how it happens. So you've got a young black man and a young white woman as the protagonists of the film, right? So they hide out in a house, in a field, where the dead are coming to get them. The dead are essentially the forces of the outside world saying, you're going to be one of us, you're going to be one of us, you're going to be one of us. Zombies are always an unstoppable force that we feel like we can't challenge. So when George Romero made Dawn of the Dead, he was talking about consumerism, must buy, must buy, must buy. When he made his other movies, every time he shows zombies, they're an allegory for something. But in this case, they were an allegory for white society essentially saying, Don't resist. Just be like us. Just shut up. Just calm down. Quiet down. Don't make too many waves. Just be like us. So later we discover in the basement of this house, there's a family. There's a hot-headed conservative guy with his tight shirt and his buzz cut, and he's got his wife and daughter downstairs, and he's saying, we have to hide in the basement. Metaphorically and literally, we have to hide in the basement, and if we just hide in the basement and do what we've always been doing and just hide, everything's going to be fine. And there's Obama / our protagonist going, nope, the world has changed. You've got to change with it. If you don't change with it, you're going to be eaten. And we've got to move on. Everything's changed now. You have to adapt. And the guy says, nope, not going to adapt. You're wrong. I'm right. We're hiding in the basement. Yeah. What happens? His daughter gets bitten. She bites him. They all die. Right?
The establishment is to its own demise.
Right. So you have the young, the young upstarts against the old school conservatives. And you watch that movie again and again. I've watched that movie, every 3-4 years for pretty much my entire life. And the best thing about good allegory is it's always true. There's always a new application for it.
So here's a question for you, specifically regarding, because I definitely want to move on, but regarding Night of the Living Dead, it's a hallmark, it's a landmark. You talk about it as being an allegory. And we know that George Romero didn't set out to make an allegorical film. He didn't want to. He didn't set out to do like this grand like commentary on the world and this is the establishment and all that. So it becomes quite obvious to me that we as a society have made this particular film an emblem of our own beliefs. Is there an alternate side to that to say? Because this film didn't have that intended. It wasn't intended to be a symbol of the civil rights movement. It didn't mean to be a symbol of kind of down with the establishment, essentially. Taking down the man. So, was there a film at the time that was trying to be like that wanted that kind of thing, or not necessarily at the time, but in general, or is it just us? Are filmmakers just wanting to make fun, scary movies, but then we, in our Mandela effect social commentary people that we are, do we just transpose our thoughts and beliefs and political systems and socio-economical situations onto these stories because we're human?
I think it's a combination of factors. Some of it's the 100th monkey syndrome, where, a monkey, given enough monkeys and enough typewriters, one will write War and Peace. But I think, sometimes you fall over backwards and land on your feet accidentally, Yeah. And sometimes you're just doing what's in your thoughts. And if society is exuding the same pressures on everybody, you're going to have the same thoughts. And so maybe you do something instinctively without even knowing it. Sometimes when I'm making a piece of art, I think, I like this, maybe somebody else will too.
Yeah.
And that's often a guiding force in this. Like, I'm pretty sure this is going to work. Maybe somebody else will think so too. And that's I'm not thinking about all those justifications at the time, but they come out because they're on my mind. The news is on in the background, and I'm thinking about what scares me, and those thoughts get transmuted into something else. There's an interesting thing that happens with horror movies where if you have a film that's not socially relevant, it's not a success in terms of horror films. And so you can remake Invasion of the Body Snatchers as many times as you want, but if it's not culturally relevant to tell that story at that particular moment, it's not going to work. There have been a few remakes of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The first one was in 1956 when you had people worried that their friends and neighbors were being turned into communists. And then in the 1970s, you had that threat a little bit again of you had Jonestown and you had cults rising up. You had hippies. You had people that you knew turning into something else. About, I don't know, what was it, 10, 15 years ago, somebody tried to remake Invasion of the Body Snatchers and it just didn't work. But I'll bet you could make it now.
Yeah.
I'll bet if you make it this year, it would totally work.
Probably. I want to move forward into kind of the the Bronze Age, which is kind of like the 80s slasher films a little bit. And specifically in regards to I think it's fair to say that in the 1950s, 1960s, Alfred Hitchcock was the master of horror. It's arguable that today, kind of talking about what you were just literally referring to, is that if a horror film isn't making a social commentary, it's not going to do very well. In that regard, it's arguable that the master of horror today might be like a Jordan Peele. But of the 80s,
there's somebody who is setting out to make social commentary.
Yes,
but he's Twilight Zone,
I
which
agree.
is all social commentary.
That's all it is, yeah. But of the 80s, I would say, or do you think it's fair to say that Wes Craven might have been the master of horror of the 80s? And maybe the 90s with Scream?
Well, you've got a couple of different things. Wes Craven did some really interesting stuff that's only starting to be respected. But I would go a little, I'd lean into John Carpenter a bit for sure.
Yeah,
They Live is a just incendiary kind of torching of the 80s consumerism.
I'm here to kick ass and to chew bubblegum, and I'm all out of bubblegum.
But that's, that film is about Reaganomics and the division between wealthy and poor people that was growing and growing and growing and really has never rebounded. But really, literally, rich people as space aliens, as monsters that are quite inhuman and only use us essentially as food. Is just keep doing what you're doing. Just spend money. Just keep spending. This dollar bill is your god. So Wes Craven did some cool stuff with Nightmare on Elm Street. And there was a huge boom in slasher films after Halloween, which is probably
Halloween. How do we leave that one off the map?
Yeah, well, that's John Carpenter right there. He likes to kickstart whole wings of horror and then just leave, just like run off and go do something else. But then after that, of course, you've got Friday the 13th, which is huge, and you've got a number of other lesser slasher films, which kind of become their own thing at that point. They shoot off and become their own branch of horror. To me, I'm not as interested in slasher movies because they're just kind of saying one thing. But in the 1980s, you have a rise in televangelism. You have Reagan as president, and you have a talk about the moral majority, right? The Christian majority. And for the first time, you have conversations, which is really a backlash of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of the 60s and 70s and disco and all of that. It's kind of a backlash to new, uptight, button-up, pearl-clutching morality. So what is Friday the 13th? You have a killer that is basically taking out anybody who violates those rules. Scream talked about this a lot.
Yes.
But you have this couple goes off and have sex and they get murdered. And this guy steals something and he gets murdered. And basically anytime anybody breaks from the norm, breaks from the moral norm, they get justifiably killed. So the teenagers you bring in there are the immoral jackasses that nobody likes.
Yeah.
And you don't for the way the killer kills them. But you have a tremendous amount of horror films in the 1980s. It really is this just massive boom. And a lot of it happens between 1982, 83. You've got Poltergeist, and you've got The Thing from 1981. You've got American Werewolf in London from 1981. You've got Wolfen. You've got Creepshow, Poltergeist, Something Wicked This Way Comes, V on TV. You've got a return of the Twilight Zone. You've got Twilight Zone the movie.
Yep.
You've got The Day After. You've got Gremlins. You got Reanimator, The Hitcher, Bad Taste, Hellraiser, Evil Dead 2. You got
it just seems like in the 80s it was a huge resurgence of the horror genre. There were scary movies, but in the bigger picture, okay, yeah, I mean, I guess to the viewer, the Gremlins probably very scary at the time, but going back and rewatching it, it's not. Come on, guys, it's not scary. It's weird. It's gruesome. It's fantastical. I don't know. Anyway. That's a whole debate for another day. But in the 80s, we do see this massive resurgence of all things like spooky, scary, creepy, Creepshow. You pointed out Creepshow. The Twilight Zone the movie.
Hmm.
Like all these, and it was more atmospherical, and I feel like that was, Rosemary's Baby kind of leading into things. The Omen, we lead in.
Well, that's interesting too, because that takes you back to the 1970s, where you have Rosie, you have the Omen, you have a lot of films. When you go back, that's Jonestown again, which was 1978. So you have the familiar being unfamiliar. So in the 70s, you've got Joe 1975, which really kickstarts the movie business, the blockbuster. You can argue that Jaws was the first blockbuster.
Yeah.
It creates the multiplex special effects boom of the 80s. But when you go back to like Rosemary's Baby and The Omen, what are those films about? They're about like, who's your child? I've given don't know, which came out of honestly thalidomide. Have you ever heard of thalidomide?
You're breaking up a little bit. It's
Okay.
the Skype connection comes and goes a little bit, so it's you. I think you're going to be okay.
Yeah. So you go from much more personal horror in the 60s and 70s to big, expansive space horror again. A lot of that comes out of the movies in the 1980s. Watched all the horror movies of the 1950s, which were about big technological booms.
That's true, yeah.
And the people that are making horror movies now grew up in the 60s and 70s and watched these more personal films. So that has a lot to do with it. But big things happened in the 80s too. America was going through a gigantic boom. You have all this new wealth. You've got the space shuttle. You've got all these things. And then even the disastrous things that happened weren't nasty like war. Vietnam was over. Those battles were already fought.
Yeah.
So the big things that happened, like in both 1986, you have both the Challenger explosion and you've got Chernobyl, which are like big, spectacular, cinematic disasters that happen.
Sure.
So, there's no surprise that that's reflected in what's going on. But you've also got a little more frivolous, a little less serious, a little more playful horror movies, like movies like Gremlins, where they're more fun. So.
Cool. I wonder, like, again, the social consciousness, what was it about, like, some of these slasher films? Because you said, like, the thing about the slasher films was that it plays to one note, essentially. Mm-hmm. When you break it down, it plays to one note, to one idea. And depending on what slasher film you're watching, is essentially the same thing over and over and over again. The creative, even though I can't get myself to watch the films, the Nightmare on Elm Street series, I think, is very fascinating from a psychological standpoint.
The Nightmare on Nightmare on Elm Street's its own thing.
Yeah,
that stuff is really cool, and
it's based on a true story too.
Sorta, yeah. But what's neat about Nightmare on Elm Street, and that's a credit to the different directors that they kept throwing at the series. Was they were very creative. They like, what do you dream about? What are your dreams? And they could get super weird and super creative with kills, tongue coming out of a phone or something like that.
Welcome to prime time.
And then you've got, I can't remember if it was the fourth Nightmare on Elm Street, but Dream Warriors.
Which I think that was the third one.
Third or fourth, yeah. But that one was really good too, because the first one was cool, and then the second one was a retread, and there was a bit of retreading, and then Dream Warriors kind of turned the idea on its head, where it's like, now let's go hunt Freddy Krueger. That was directed by Frank Darabont, by the way, who went on to do Green Mile, and he went on to do
So I just looked it up on IMDb. Let me bring it up on screen here.
And
Nightmare on Elm Street 3 is directed by Chuck Russell.
Chuck Russell did Dream Warriors?
That's what IMDb is saying.
Huh. Okay, which one did Frank Darabont do?
Stand by. While I'm looking this up, go ahead and Phil, if you please.
But anyway, you've got a bunch of different directors. I believe Chuck Russell actually did The Blob as well, the 1980s version of The Blob, which is really an underrated horror film. It's really fun. Interesting side note: the original Blob scared the living crap out of me when I was 5 years old. Made me afraid of cherry Jello and drains. Here we go. All filmography. Direct.
Boy, for anybody watching this video right now, this is the most interesting thing just to watch us look up
Right?
stuff on IMDb. This.
Yeah.
All right, where are we?
I think Frank Darabont must have had something to do with it, but I can't remember what. Maybe he wrote it. Maybe he wrote it.
Yeah, I went through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, I'm not seeing.
Oh, yeah, he wrote the screenplay for Dream Warriors. That's what it was.
Okay, there it goes.
Didn't direct.
All right. So in the 80s, sorry, we took a huge pause there. So in the 80s,
Sure did.
we have this huge resurgence, a lot of creativity going into horror films. The slasher kind of becomes a thing. We move into the 90s, and we see with the Scream franchise. Again, Wes Craven kind of takes the horror genre. Everything that we think we know about it flips it on its head. Kind of pulls an Alfred Hitchcock and kills Drew Barrymore right out of the gate. In the first film, you're like, hey, Drew Barrymore, one of the biggest stars of the world right now. She's in this brand new horror film, and she's dead within the first 5 minutes or 3 minutes of the movie.
I've watched Scream with a couple of my filmmaking friends. And we really pick that movie apart because as funny as it is, as witty as it is, it really does well with the scares. And we were watching particularly the opening scene with Drew Barrymore. Yeah. And we were all saying, this scene is really unsettling. What is it about this that makes it so unsettling? Like more so than a lot of other movies we were watching at the time. And it's a combination of different things. One is that the house has a ton of windows. And it's dark outside. So she's being watched. But another neat thing about that, and the way that film is shot, is that anytime she gets up and moves, the camera is advancing on her. Like anytime she turns away from the camera, it moves in a little closer. So when she's walking down a hallway, the camera is actually moving up behind her.
Weird.
And it's
cool.
Really cool trick. That's like really a masterful move from either the director or cinematographer. I don't know whose decision that was, but it's really brilliant. Wow. And it just does a great job of setting up the movie. And of course, the fact that first her boyfriend gets killed. Yeah. You see him out on the porch and he's all tied up, and then you see him sliced open and his guts literally spill out. You go, wow, anything can happen in this movie, which is something that
it means you're not safe.
Really,
to the viewer, you're not safe.
No. I mean, that was 1996. That was kind of deep into the 90s. But that feeling of unease was new. That wasn't something that was in the 80s horror movies. And I think a lot of that came from, we had a lot of, you had Jeffrey Dahmer show up in the 1990s, which was kind of like, oh my God, how could this happen? This was just like
Jeffrey Dahmer
normal, quiet guy.
In the 90s?
Yeah. Yeah, he was like the normal quiet guy in the neighborhood, and he was eating people and chewing them up, and so movies got in the 90s, they kind of went away from the big special effects boom, apart from Jurassic Park, and kind of collapsed inward and got smaller and smaller and smaller to like personal things, inside things. You had both Jacob's Ladder and Misery in 19. Which were psychological films. Jacob's Ladder, larger in scope, but all pretty much inside of his head. And you've got Misery, which is just a movie with, honestly, 3 people in it. It could have been a stage play, would make an excellent stage play. And then by 1991, you've got Silence of the Lambs, which is one of the first, really high-end horror movies, actually almost like art house horror, which is a much more common thing now. But you had it was almost a prestige picture.
Well, it was because it won Best Picture at the Oscars.
Right, and it should have. It's an incredible film, but it was the first time that it was really a big leap for horror films to go from something that critics had just panned to them going, wow, crap, this is actually really good. Maybe we should pay attention. So the twist ending kind of came into play with films like Silence of the Lambs. And then you also got all of the security of the 80s that we had, all the like everything's great, all things are great. You've got the disillusionment of Generation X, my generation in the 1990s, going, everything's great. Why am I so miserable? Why am I still not feeling good? You've got movies like Seven, which is all about that underbelly.
Ooh. Oh, so
Everything's perfect. It's not. Everything's wrong. Everything's
yeah.
bad. And it's right underneath the surface. And if you just lift up that little piece of paper, you'll see it. You'll see all the worms crawling around in there. That's what Seven's all about. And that's what Fight Club's about, too, which comes out in the same year.
Well, in the
So,
90s, we also kind of see a little bit of an emergence of like the psychological thriller slash horror, because that even that line started getting blurred quite a bit. I guess it's arguable that Psycho 1959, or I guess 1960, was a psychological thriller. But in the late 90s, we're seeing films like Fight Club, we're seeing Seven, we're seeing The Sixth Sense, and then we start like getting into the early 2000s, and we see films like Saw, which is. It's not so much of it's kind of a psychological thriller, but it's more just complete gruesome horror. Uh,
yeah, you got Hostel, you got
yeah.
the red torture porn. And that comes out of, too, like, how do we shock people anymore? Like, are people just unshockable? Let's see how far we can push that. Let's see how gross we can make something, and at the same time examine our insatiable need for filth.
Yeah.
And that those also kind of like attack the kind of button up perfection personality that you also see in American Psycho, where you're like, everything's perfect on the outside, but if you just lift up the cover just a little and look underneath, right there in that thin little space, there's murder and mayhem and blood and guts and all sorts of horrible things.
So if I can address like some of the movies like Saw and Hostel and like the really gruesome like body horror, but like extreme body horror movies. Horror films are always a reflection of the times that we live in. What is it that those films are saying about 2000 late 2000s, 2010s?
Helplessness. Think about what happened right at the beginning of 2000. You have 9/11.
Yeah.
You have a president that didn't win, but still won. Whatever you want to make of that politically, it was one of the first presidents to ever win by not winning. He lost the popular vote and won the Electoral College. And then right after that, you have 9/11. Now, the only thing that I could relate to when 9/11 happened, which was a moment of, well, you all remember where you were, was when the Challenger blew up. That was immediately what I flashed back to, because I wasn't alive when JFK was shot. I wasn't alive during the Vietnam War. So for my generation, that was the first real shock, and it was something that we all immediately came together on. When that happened, I don't know how old you were at the time, but I was in my 20s, and I got a call from my parents, and they told me what happened, and then immediately you're on the phone to everybody else, and all you can do is just watch the TV.
Yeah.
And so everything changes, and we have the idea of helplessness. We have the idea of terrorism. We have this feeling of complete loss of control. In the 80s, you've got everything's great, and I'm going to invest in the stock market, and I'm going to buy a yacht, and things are good, and I've got all the women and all the cocaine I want. And in the 90s, you're like, I did all the things I was supposed to do, and like what Seven says, or I'm sorry, not Seven, but Fight Club says, I did all the things that I'm supposed to do, and I'm still helpless. I still feel helpless. I still feel out of control. And so a lot of those movies that start to happen then are movies about nameless enemies, an apocalypse that you can't quite get a grip on. You've got 2000 opens with Final Destination, which is about how no matter what you do,
Forgot about that
no matter
series.
what you do, death is going to get you. And if you're marked, you're going to die. So that positivity kind of starts to dissolve until by the end of the decade, you've got a film like The Mist, which is a deeply cynical film. I mean, it's a
That was
brilliant film.
Thomas
Absolutely.
Jane. He was the star of that film, right? Yeah.
Thomas
Okay.
Jane, yeah. Thomas Jane, Marcia Gay Harden, and
Half the
you
cast of The
have
Walking Dead.
people. You're right, right. And that Frank Darabont wrote that movie, even though it's based on a Stephen King story, in a large part in response to how people were feeling about the Gulf War. Again, body snatchers. The idea that you have these monsters coming out of the mist, and you can't control them, and you don't know what they are. But even worse than that are the humans that you're stuck inside with. They're changing. They're becoming something else. They're being body snatched. And I remember when I saw that at the time, I felt, after it was over, I felt just wrecked by it, completely wrecked by it. And I won't spoil the ending for anybody of our 3 viewers that haven't seen it.
We currently have 4 people watching the show right now, so go us!
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, okay. It's a very cynical film, and when I saw it, I was pretty much bowled away. I was like, that was a great movie, but I'm pretty well wrecked. And in the ensuing years, I watched it a couple times and had the same feeling. And now I watched it about 2 weeks ago, and was like, that is a perfect film.
It's pretty great.
That's an absolutely perfect film. And like I said, like, the best allegory is always true, or only becomes more true. And that one certainly has become more true, if anything, where you have your friends and neighbors, people you've known your whole life, turn against you and become this zombie mob. They become zombies, which in this case, they're worse than zombies because they're thinking zombies.
Yeah.
You know, they're decision-making zombies, and they've all changed, and they've all decided that collectively we are one, and you're bad and we're good, and you know that they've drawn that division line. So
let's move forward a little bit. Currently, in our current state, we have I guess you could call it a classic. I mean, it's as soon as it came out, I felt like this movie was like the quintessential horror film, which was Stephen King's It. We have not a remake, but the sequel to The Shining, which we didn't even talk about The Shining earlier. We have a sequel to The Shining, Dr. Sleep. We have a lot of Jordan Peele properties coming out, or that have come out. A lot of social commentary that is meant to be social commentary in the guise of horror. We even have television shows on TV right now, like Lovecraft Country, that harkens back to the old school, like early 19-teens horror, mystical fantasy horror, but in a new context that addresses like the racist problems that have happened throughout the decades, and how we, like, what it is, not what we can do to help fight some of these things. But I think properties like that, like, even though I'm not a fan of the show Lovecraft Country, I actually think it's not a very good show in storytelling wise. I think I'm the only person on the planet who thinks this. Just narratively, I think it's terrible. But the interesting thing about the state, like the social consciousness that we currently live in, and with a show like Lovecraft Country, I think it's very, very smart and very clever to use racism as the horror. Like, that is the horror. It's not the monsters coming up out of the ground that are, gonna kill us, that are scary. It's the evil that people do to other people. And I think that's the message. Is that the message of horror films now, or is it more complex? Is there something else?
It has always been the message, because we're always the monsters, and we've always been the monsters. I mean, there's no troll living up in the mountains. There's no monster living in the deep lake. There's no vampires, really. Honestly, there's no mummy. Horror movies are always about
There's a classic episode of The Twilight Zone from the 1959, 1960. I can't remember what season it is. It might be in the first season. Doesn't matter. It's called The Monsters Are Living on Maple Street.
Monsters Are Due on Maple Street.
Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. And the whole town is just they're a buzz waiting for these monsters to come, or aliens or something. They think something is coming to get them, and as they can't figure out what to do with themselves, so they start fighting amongst each other.
Right.
And the arguing
Right.
turns into fist fighting, and the fist fighting turns into like burning houses down and cars on fire, and that's when we come to realize, and I'm totally going to spoil the ending, which, I mean, let's be honest, you should have seen it coming when I started this, is that
Right.
there are no monsters, and it's the people, it's the neighbors. We are the ones who inflict evil upon each other.
But better yet, the camera moves out to the aliens that have landed, and they're sitting on a hill.
Oh, that's right.
And just
yeah.
say, see, you just put them at it, and they do it themselves. They do it to themselves. You just introduce a little bit of chaos, and they do the rest.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the word that's what Russia was trying to do in the last 4 years, which is not take over, sow chaos, and let us do it. You know, that's the monster in the horror movie is always us. And we just as easily can be the monster as fight the monster. And that's really something that ties all of them together. I would say that right now we are living in the golden age of horror. I think there have been better horror films made in the last 15 years than we've ever seen. You've got small little movies like The Conjuring, which looks like, oh yeah, that looks like it's a goofy little ghost story. It's like legitimately really a great film. And you've got films like It, which is, it hits what I call the Pixar button, where it's a film that makes you laugh, cry, cheer, be scared, dread. It runs you through all of those emotions. And Pixar movies are great at doing that, where they can make you
minus
laugh
the dread.
hysterically. Sometimes there's dread.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's fair. Finding Nemo,
But they
there's
can make you laugh in equal measure as they make you cry. And that's a movie that's a thing that it does really well. I almost wish there wasn't a sequel, because the sequel didn't come close to doing justice to the first film. But I think that it's just a perfect film on its own.
So where are we
Chapter
going?
one.
Where is horror headed? What is it that we can expect from the horror genre in the next 20 years, 40 years?
Boy, that's
we have an entire century of history when it comes to horror films. What's the next century going to look like?
Well, here's the cool thing that makes this the new golden age of horror, is that horror now has become, when I was a kid, horror was still kind of scoffed at, like, oh, only those kind of people watch those movies, you
right.
know, like, but now it's a mainstream thing, and now it's something that's pretty universally respected. And it's because our whole lives, our parents' whole lives, horror movies have been a thing. And, you know, we've had respected horror movies ever since basically The Shining. So what's cool about that, and what I really hope doesn't change too much, is that horror movies can take chances that other movies can't take, because they operate on those fringes.
Right.
You know, because they can do like things around the ragged edges, and kind of where movie studios go, yeah, here's $5 million, go make your horror movie, leave us alone, we're trying to win Oscars here. You know, and because of that, people are really able to push those limits. And because you can make a horror movie with next to no money.
The Invisible Man was, I keep going back to this well. The Invisible Man, made by Blumhouse, was made on a shoestring budget of $7 million. And you know how much they grossed?
Oh, good.
$110 million off of a $7 million budget.
Yeah,
it was
it's such a great film.
And
Did you see his previous film? Did you see his previous film, Upgrade?
You were the one who told me to go watch Upgrade, and I still haven't done it yet. I have not done it yet.
It's good in all the ways that Invisible Man is good. It's, you know, just it's a really surprising film and smarter than you think. The coolest thing about Invisible Man is that both the villain and the heroine are incredibly smart and incredibly resourceful. Yeah. And that's really neat, because, you know, occasionally you see a movie where the villain's smarter than the protagonist, but just barely. But what I love about that movie is that both of those people are smarter than anybody watching it, which is really cool to see. It's really neat to see somebody like, you know, she's very scarred by what's happened to her, and you can see that take a toll on who she is. But at the same time, her resourcefulness and her smarts are just off the charts, and you just really root for it because of that. And at the same time, like one of the great villains of all time, James Bond's Goldfinger, he's always a step ahead,
Oh man.
always a step ahead
Yep.
of Bond, always just a little bit smarter, a little bit faster, a little bit quicker, and he just like leads him wherever you want him to go. So it makes that payoff at the ending just so much better.
So much
It's that
sweeter.
final that final unexpected checkmate. I know that you do comedy, so
Truth.
I know that you know what makes a joke work, in that it has to do with your build up and then your payoff. And if you're really solid at it, you've got a nice big build up, then you get some payoff, and then you go a level above that. You're one step higher. And
Yeah.
horror is interesting because a scare works the same way. You've got to build it up just right, and you got to pay it off just right. And if you can double that, even better. Maybe even a callback works. you know, Maybe if you can call back to something that happens in the beginning, that little seed that you plant. Like
Well, speaking, this is the perfect segue. Speaking of callbacks to something that happened in the beginning, I would like to go back to the beginning of our show. I raised a few different questions. Now that we've kind of had an opportunity to go through, the century of, horror film and cinema, I kind of want to go back to some of these questions that we asked before and see if we have any more definitive answers, if anything is a little bit more clear in the matter. Let's go back to the first question. Ron, what is horror? What is horror? We kind of danced around this a little bit of that, horror is something scary. It's something that attacks you.
Mm-hmm.
Previously, I kind of defined it as, I see horror as anything that is scary to the main character.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily need to be scary to the viewer. I feel that is, anytime that it's scary to the viewer, I find that to be a scary movie.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's just scary to the main character or to the people in the film, then it becomes more of an action movie. Then it becomes more of a psychological thriller. Then it becomes this and that, and whatever. Do you have a different perception on, quote, what is horror?
Kinda. I like that definition, though. I think that's really an apt definition. It's like it's one of those things where I say I don't know how to define it, but I know when I see it. But to a certain extent, we know what a horror movie is because we know what a horror movie poster looks like.
Yeah.
Right? So I think it comes down to when you're sitting around the campfire and your kid comes up to you and he says, "Dad, tell me a scary story." That's where the horror movie starts. It's when you as an audience member engage yourself and say, "Okay, I'm going to lock myself in. This is what I want to hear right now. This is what I want to see right now." It's when you're going to the video store as a kid and you're looking through action samurai movies and you're looking through this kind, and you go to the horror movie section and say, "Okay, this is what I want." And you can say that Nightmare Before Christmas isn't a horror movie necessarily, and it's arguably far less scary than movies that don't intend to be scary at all.
Sure.
So, but it's certainly a Halloween movie, and it's certainly it's a fun movie, and it has all those elements of horror in there that don't scare us, that we kind of relate to and we kind of like. That says a lot about Tim Burton as who he is as a person, where he's like, these are the things that I love. I hope you love them too. And in the same way as you create something saying, "I like this, I hope you also like it."
Yeah.
But it comes down to the intent of saying, "I'm going to sit down and I'm going to watch a scary movie." And sometimes we get kind of suckered into horror elements of like Lord of the Rings, which has some very scary, very horror movie-like sequences. But at no point do you say, "I didn't know this was a horror film." You kind of roll with it in a way that you say, "Well, I wouldn't see a movie about Shelob, the giant spider. I wouldn't see a movie about that." But you're suckered into seeing this.
I 1,000% would. In fact, I hope that's one entire episode of the new upcoming Hobbit Middle Earth Amazon show.
God.
Oh, I think that would be great.
Yeah, in that case, see Dragon Slayer.
Play the video game.
That's Dragon's Lair is the video game, but Dragon Slayer.
Oh, Slayer! I thought you said Lair.
Slayer. Yeah, no, the 1982 Matthew Robbins film.
Well, there you go.
Man, that's what that movie is about.
All right,
talk about a movie with socio-political commentary. Oh my god.
Ooh, well, now we all have to watch it. I want to
Yeah.
move on to the next question. Again, I think we kind of already answered this. What's the difference between a scary movie and a horror movie? I already gave my thoughts. Do you have a differing opinion on what's the difference between a scary movie and a horror movie?
Well, again, I think that the horror movie is the movie that you intend to watch because you want to be scared or you want that horror experience. And a movie that is scary is a movie that, like, maybe you watch not intending to watch a horror movie, but that's what you got. You got a little scared. Black Swan's a good example. Man, that's a scary movie.
Ooh.
Oh my God, I think Black Swan disturbed me more than most any horror movie I've seen in the last 20 years. But it's not really a horror movie. But it
I
kind
think
of
that's
is.
a good word. I think that's a good qualifier. Is that you have horror, you have scary, and then you have disturbing. Because Mulholland Drive is a great film. It's a fantastic film. I made the mistake of watching it all by myself at midnight. So by the time the movie was over, it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was all by myself. And if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. If you have not seen the movie, it messed me up. Like, it really messed me up. It put me in a bad place.
Man, that's one of the great scares in movie history.
But it's
right
not
there.
a horror film. It's not a scary movie, but it is
No.
disturbing on a very profound level.
It establishes a good sense of dread. Another movie, Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene, which is a film that came out maybe 10 years ago now, is about a woman who it's what's her name, the twins from Full House. It's their
Olsen,
sister.
Elizabeth Olsen,
Elizabeth
Scarlet
Olsen's in it.
Witch,
Yeah, that was a long way around to find the
Wanda
solution to that.
Maximoff.
Yeah, but it's about a woman who has escaped from a cult, and it's about her, like, recovering from her escape from this cult.
Interesting.
And it's not a horror film, but it's as disturbing as anything I've ever
Yeah.
watched. It's certainly more disturbing than a lot of horror films that I watch. So what makes that difference from, say, The Shining? The Shining has something like a supernatural element to it, a fantastical element, that's not present in everyday life, which means it's not necessarily a horror film. And movie like Silence of the Lambs rides that line, but it's about a serial killer playing mind games,
Right.
and so it bridges that, yeah. But it's not The Conjuring, for instance.
Oof.
Now I could talk my wife into watching Black Swan, and she'll watch it perfectly happy and really enjoy it, but she wouldn't watch The Conjuring.
Nope. Hard pass for me. Hard pass. Something that is not a hard pass for me is again, we addressed this all the way at the beginning of our discussion here. What draws us to these types of movies? What is it about humanity that we just are attracted to gore and violence and the insatiable desire to be instilled with fear? Why are we drawn to these things, Ron?
It's have you ever seen the movie Deathgasm?
No.
It's a New Zealand film.
Sounds
about
delightful.
metal, about heavy metal. It's actually a really, really funny film. It's kind of along the lines of Shaun of the Dead in a lot of ways.
Okay.
But it's about a couple of heavy metal kids that find this record that's supposed to be either written by Satan or something like that, having satanic lyrics, and they decide to play the music, or they find the sheet music and they play it, and it brings about the apocalypse. And but early on in the film, this girl's asking him, "What do you like about heavy metal music?" And I love metal and kind of always have to a certain degree. And he talks about how, feeling like an outcast and feeling like you're not good enough and nothing's good, that something that's specifically dark, specifically supposed to be evil and dark and scary is actually a comfort. It actually makes you feel better. And so when you feel dreadful, or you feel in a way, it justifies the way you feel. In a way, it something scary makes me feel less scared.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways.
Like if you can tolerate this, if you can get through this experience, then that didn't kill you, and that you're that much better for it.
Sure, and it gives you the experience of, like, going up to that edge and looking over that edge and being able to safely step back and say, I experienced that. It's like watching guys in wingsuits shoot down canyons,
Yeah.
which is no way I'll ever do that ever. But I'm so grateful for the inventors of GoPro for letting me experience that,
Sure.
because I get to walk myself up to that edge and kind of feel that adrenaline rush of doing it, and then the adrenaline rush of, I'm glad that didn't happen to me. So you get to experience that fear and excitement of being in that space without actually having to go through it, and hopefully not take too much of it home with you. When I was really young, I saw The Blob, as I mentioned before. I was about 5 years old, and I was scared of drains. I was scared of cracks, air vents. I was
Yeah.
afraid of cherry Jello, of all things, which, like, my mom couldn't figure out why I didn't want to eat cherry Jello anymore, because it was like my favorite thing. And all of a sudden, I wanted nothing to do with it. But it affected me so deeply. And then years later, I saw John Carpenter's The Thing, which I was probably 10 or 11 years old. And it was a movie that I felt like I had to watch. I'd read about it, and I'd read a couple magazine articles about it. I just felt like I had to see this movie. And so my mom finally relented and let me watch this thing. And I swear to God, it just scarred me. It scarred me for like a year. I was completely messed up. Still one of my all-time number one favorite movies. I love this film. And I think I just love because it's able to get under my skin so much, and I can come away from it and I can be safe after it. But I think, as a lot of geeks are, whether it was that you were picked on or you didn't fit in when you were younger, there's a sense of, like, this thing that disturbs everybody else actually makes me feel happy. It makes, suddenly I'm the creature in the dark that everybody else is scared of. And by loving this thing that not everybody loves, I've got, like, a little notch on everybody else.
Yeah.
I've got this thing that I just love to experience. And then when you find somebody else that appreciates it as much as you do, then there's like an instant bond where you can go, oh yeah, John Carpenter's The Thing, when that happened, oh my God, like instant. In the same way that, like, 5 minutes into our conversation, we started talking about movies and we talked about the things we had in common. Like, all of a sudden there's like an instant click, It's
Connection with another
when
human being.
you find somebody that collects those Funko Pops, or when you go to Comic-Con and see, like, oh my God, there's a whole world of geekdom out
Or
here.
whatever your interests are. It's I've being in my other day job, I work as a flight attendant. Hey, I'm an American in I don't know, Germany. Hey, I see another American. It's that finding connectivity between humanity.
Right. And if you met that guy on the street somewhere, you just wouldn't be like, hey,
who
whatever.
cares? Bye.
Who's that? Yeah.
Yeah. I want to move on to the next question. Is there a quote unquote master of horror? I mean, previously we talked about we name dropped like Alfred Hitchcock, Wes Craven, maybe a modern day like Jordan Peele, maybe even further back like a George Méliès. But is there a quintessential master of horror, or is it the kind of thing that the genre just keeps changing and there is no one master?
It does. It's like saying, who's the best guitarist, You can definitely say Eddie Van Halen, but
Rest in peace.
Somebody else is going to.
Whoa, hey there. Whoa. Oh, okay. It took me a minute. I was like, this is a family-friendly show there, Ron.
Yeah.
What's happening right now?
I got to show off my 1978 Van Halen belt buckle. But so it comes down to somebody could equally argue Jimi Hendrix, but the name that always jumps into my head first is John Carpenter, mostly because, as I said, he works around that ragged edge of acceptability, of, like, he's like the secret guy, He's like, he never became the big mainstream director. He's never become Steven Spielberg. He's just, like, poked those little genres into existence, those little subgenres of horror. He's just kind of stuck them a little bit and kind of pushed things forward. But Alfred Hitchcock brought a level of respectability to it because he was already a respected director before he made Psycho, before he made The Birds.
Well, even North by Northwest is arguably, I mean, I wouldn't call it a horror film per se, but a movie that puts you on the edge of your seat and your nerves are on fire for 90% of the movie. Woof.
Then what is horror but that plus a few skulls,
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
I'd like to move into the last question. Is there such a thing as the quintessential horror movie? I saw on Facebook very recently, the other day, somebody was asking the question. They posed the question, um, what is the best Halloween movie? And
Oh, the best Halloween movie. Oh my
and
gosh.
I was, a lot of people were chiming in with what their favorite things were, like Nightmare Before Christmas or, um, geez, I don't know, Hocus Pocus or whatever, or, Nightmare on Elm Street. And for me, having never seen the film, I know a lot about it, but I would contend maybe the quintessential, the best Halloween movie, which is still a different category from the best horror movie, um, would be Halloween. John Carpenter's 1978 Halloween. It's the holiday's namesake first and foremost.
Mm,
You have an iconic character that kind of. It's again kind of arguable that Michael Myers was the first of the slasher films. We have
mhm.
the iconic look. We have the mask and all of the lore and history behind the mask with William Shatner. And it's a series that has continued on. Like we're still getting again, like next year we're getting Halloween Kills, another sequel in or
Yeah.
reboot whole thing. So it's a franchise that all started with one film, and I would contend Halloween is the best Halloween movie. Even the film, it takes place on Halloween Day, which I guess arguably a lot of Halloween movies do take place on Halloween Day or night or whatever. Um, but I don't know. Like, do you see a difference? The best Halloween movie. Is there a quintessential horror film?
It's a tough call because you would say what's the best Christmas movie, and you go, well, A
Polar
Christmas
Express.
Story, or It's a Wonderful Life, or Polar Express. Yeah, you'd say one of
No,
those
no, no, no,
three.
no.
And
It's Polar Express.
is it? I don't know. It's kind of the corpses kind of freak me out. The uncanny valley of that movie kind of freaks me out a
Yeah.
little
Oh yeah.
bit. But yeah, it's the one that respects and kind of honors the feeling. Like what does Halloween feel like? What does that day feel like? And Nightmare Before Christmas is an excellent one because it talks about like what Halloween means and how wrong that goes if you try to apply it to another
Mm.
holiday. But and Halloween's another great one. I really enjoy Trick or Treat, which I watched the other night with my kids. Which I don't know, might not be a movie to watch with kids, but
Depends on how old
it's
they
an
are.
episode. It's an episodic film, kind of like Creep Show, where you've got these four different stories that are going simultaneously through this Halloween night in Ohio. So it's got all the elements of Halloween. It's really a fun movie. I wouldn't say it's a great film, but it's a lot of fun. It's a really you know and I've talked to my kids that the minute October starts, we only watch horror movies. We're not allowed to watch anything else. So that's all we watch for the month of October. And so we make up a list, and we make up a list at the beginning of the month, and I'll pull it up here. Just so we've got Us and They Live and Scream and The Woman in Black, which oh my god is a great
I
film.
never saw
The
the
Shining
film,
and
but I saw The Woman in Black like the stage production in London. And I
really
was like, you know what?
oh
It's a stage production. This isn't gonna come on. It can't be scary. Freaked me
oh
out.
but it was
It
fantastic.
freaked me out.
Yeah,
Ugh.
it's a great story. It's a I wouldn't say underrated because it's pretty well rated. I just feel it's
Mm.
underseen. Um, but yeah, I think Halloween would be a really good choice. But the neat thing about that is I don't have to say one film. I can run down this list I've got of 20 films and go any one of these would be great to
Yeah,
watch this year. And if we don't get to it this year, next year we got another one, and next year we got
it's
another
true.
bunch. And there's a whole bunch of movies coming out right now. So it's a wonderful luxury that we don't have to pick just one movie to watch or one guitarist to
It's
listen to
true.
or things. We get so much of it, and there's more now than there's ever been. I don't know what's coming next in horror. Anyone who says there are new ideas is somebody that has no new ideas. So it's not my job to call on that. But I think we keep seeing movies like The Babadook, which is a terrifying film, and I think is just as important as a movie about psychology as Psycho is. Um, that's both retro styled but forward thinking, in so many
Yeah.
ways. And I think we're going to see a lot of that. And a lot of it's going to have to do with what changes in culture, even in November, that's going to change our society. What's going to happen? I think there's going to be a great number of films coming out from just having to deal with a pandemic
Yeah,
for
it's
a
true.
year.
I hope
However
we're not
long.
going to get like pandemic films or, movie, like maybe, reference, oh, do you remember that time that we had to wear face masks for a year? Like stuff like that. But I don't know, as a genre, as a like a thing, I don't know. I would prefer not to see that. Let's use it as inspiration or like
Right.
get the morality out of that.
But it's interesting too, because when something like this happens, you immediately draw on your experience of what's happened before that's similar to
Right.
this. Like, for instance, everybody going out and renting Outbreak and Contagion. But another movie series that they revisited was The Purge, which has to do with locking yourselves away from
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
And that's, every once in a while there's a film that like fits allegorically into a current situation, and The Purge has done a great job of that with their different films. But sometimes they lead the target a little bit. Like The Purge seems to be about what happened years later, in the same way as Starship Troopers, which was made in '97, is a I
I
think
think
I want to say
so. I
'97.
think you're
That's
right. Yeah.
my head guess. But if you watch that, having lived through 9/11, it's a completely different film, and it almost feels like it predicted the future a little bit.
Yeah.
So I don't know what we're going to see next. I'm excited. I'm always excited next year. I'm super bummed at this moment that I've got to wait another year to see Dune.
Oh
So
man, yeah.
so
Well, you and a lot of people. Ron, we're gonna start to wrap things up a little bit as we always do
okay.
towards the end of the show, and we've gone over just a little bit. First of all, how are you doing on time, buddy? You
I
good?
got time.
Okay, cool. Uh,
I I blocked out time for this, so I'm good.
I always tell my guests block out 90 minutes, and sometimes we go over that 90-minute mark. But at the
Hour and 40. That's
keep
cool.
on going, keep on trucking. At the end of every show, I always like to take people's live questions. So if anybody's watching this live, go ahead and jump down to the comment section below and drop some comments, drop some questions. I'm going to start reading through. A few people have commented a few things here or there, but yeah, we're just going to go through and let's check that live questions intro, shall we?
Alive! It's alive! It's alive!
All right, so yeah, that's here. Now it's time to take some live questions. So we're just gonna jump right in. Our first live question is I think all of the live questions are from a mutual friend of ours, Karen Brown. Karen's my cousin, who currently
Hey,
lives
Karen.
in Southern Virginia. So Karen, thanks for watching the show. Thanks for being part of the discussion. And Karen says, with her Karen potty mouth, if I can call you out. She says, "That's me, darn flying monkeys." Of course, in reference to what we were talking about earlier, with sorry, my mind went blank. Wizard of Oz. It.
Buzz.
I mean, as you pointed out, those flying monkeys are kind of terrifying. I mean, as a child, I enjoyed that because that was the aspect of the Wizard of Oz that I actually found interesting and engaging. So I actually made a connection with that. But what was your initial reaction to seeing the flying monkeys?
Boy, I mean that's something that we all grew up watching Wizard of Oz from a very young age. But honestly, one of the things that really stuck with me, and it seemed to like pervade my dreams almost, is the shots of the witch's castle and those guys coming out of the castle,
Yeah.
uh, and that kind of darkness. And I saw that mirrored very much again in Lord of the Rings,
Yeah, you're
when
right.
if it was the Two Towers or Return of the King, where you had the orcs coming out of the front of the castle, but it was very
Yeah.
similar, like very very dark.
Oh, it was
Everything is very
beautiful. Beautiful.
does such a great of creating that dark atmosphere as a contrast to the really otherwise bright land of Oz. That forest with the trees that are like all scraggly and all of that. I think that was probably my first kind of horror experience, and how that got under my skin was really kind of addictive. And made me seek out
Well,
more of it
to your
as I
point,
grew up.
oh shoot, who was it? Groucho Marx very famously said, referring about comedy, but good comedy is created, but great comedy is stolen. So, I mean, a lot of that can be applied to, the arts in general. You look at something like the Flying Monkeys or the like the marching soldiers from Return of Oz. That's a horror movie. I will contend that's a great film. But just to see that, like those concepts and those ideas being stolen, or this show, for example, this is a great show. Wink. I've stolen the show from another YouTuber, somebody that I love very much. He has no idea who I am, but I've pretty much lifted his entire format, and this is what we do. So it's the idea of like you see something that you love and you want to emulate it, right?
Right. Well, I can go one further with that and tell you that the entire class that I taught, all of my exhaustive notes on history and the horror film, which I have in very convenient
Whoa,
format.
Look at that.
Like breaking things down by decade. I've got important historical events here and other historical events here, like who was president at the time, who we were at war with at the time, so I could match all this stuff together. Most of this was lifted in part by one of my college professors, Dr. David Soren, who was a brilliant teacher, and he wrote the book on horror, which is called The Rise and Fall of the Horror Film. And he taught a course called Art History of the Horror Film, which was my inspiration for just about everything I've done with horror since then, because he was able to take things like Gothic architecture and relate it to horror, relate it to how it's perceived in horror films. Like Gothic architecture wasn't really intended to be spooky and creepy. We only look at it that way because of films like Dracula, which used it, like, bats flying through there and these ruins of Gothic cathedrals. But initially the design was light and openness. It wasn't these dark bones looming behind the graveyard. So it was an interesting way of integrating really how art history is interwoven with the rise of horror films. And it's interesting because that book was called The Rise and Fall of the Horror Film, but it was written in the late 80s, early 90s when horror genre was kind of drifting out. So
not anymore.
I wouldn't be surprised if his students aren't making films at this moment and are responsible for the re-rise.
The rise and fall and re-rise of horror.
Yeah.
Karen goes on to say, loved Coraline. Well, I mean, who didn't? It was a creepy movie, but that's a great movie.
Yeah.
She says, riveting, I assume referring to Coraline. For a few more comments down, she says, Winter's Bone. I don't recall Winter's Bone being a horror film.
I haven't seen it yet.
Winter's Bone, hold on, now I have to look this up. Winter's Bone, I do believe, hold on, let me go back to IMDb. IMDb, sorry everybody. Let's go back here, and then we will look at Winter's Bone. I believe it was Jennifer Lawrence. Winter's Bone. Yeah, Jennifer Lawrence. It was okay. This is in unflinching Ozark Mountain Girl hacks through dangerous social terrain as she hunts down her drug-dealing father while trying to keep her family intact. So, not a horror film per se, but I can definitely see. I remember seeing it back in 2010. I don't remember a lot of details about it, but I can definitely see some of the horror elements, like, even in the resurgence of, what's his face? M. Night Shyamalan, with The Visit, or, what do you do after that? Split. Like, kind of, they're not horror films per se, but there's this tone of the film that is unsettling. And I think that tone definitely, lends itself to that a lot. Karen says, Hi, Karen.
Hi, Karen.
Literally all of these comments are from Karen. Karen says, terrifying monkeys, nightmares for weeks. That's exactly how I felt about Stephen King's It, Chapter 1, the remake with the Skarsgård, Bill Skarsgård.
Yeah, Skarsgård.
Oh. And let's replace weeks with months, because it was literal months. 4 months. I had to sleep with the lights on. I kid you not.
That was the first movie I took my son to see that was a horror film. And I think he was about 11, 12 years old, I think. And he brought his jacket with him and spent most of the movie like looking out.
Oh, man.
But he loved it. He absolutely loved it. And we've seen it several times since.
Oh man,
Yeah.
I can't. I don't think I could ever. I don't think I could ever go back to that movie. It's terrifying. It scared the pants off me.
Kids need scars, and I'm proud to have given him some of his first.
It's a rite of passage, I guess. And Karen finishes off our live comments by saying it was creepy. I believe that comment was in reference to Winter's Bone. Again, I saw it when it first came out. I don't quite remember all of it. I remember the tone and it definitely having this unsettled feeling to it, but.
Well, there's a difference between a horror film and a scary film, right?
Well, you know what? Even I will say there were a lot of parts to Jurassic Park that were unsettling. Like when they were crawling on their hands and knees in the rafters, or I guess in like the service ducts or whatever, and Lexi falls and she's, hanging on for dear life, and she kicks the raptor in the face, and the raptor's down on the ground, and everybody's trying to pull her back up into the ventilation shaft, and the velociraptor jumps up and misses her leg by an inch. Oh.
and interesting side note, that's the very first example of face replacement used in film. Yeah.
It's all done by a stunt double. Oh, It was so good.
Yeah. There's a moment where she looks straight up and you can see it's Lexi's face, but it's the stunt double.
We do have another comment coming in from Not Karen Brown. What?
Wait.
This is from Erica Sturgeon, and Erica says, going back.
Hey,
Erica. Erica. Hi, Erica. Thanks for being on the show. Thanks for being part of what we're doing here.
Erica has can claim the exclusive right of being in one of my film courses. So,
an exclusive right that was not made privy to me. So Erica says, going back to the fear of the taken or disappearing characters, I've always associated that as a metaphor for the fear of death or no longer being here. Interesting.
Sure.
Well,
and you deal with the idea that, like, say, for instance, in a breakup where somebody just leaves, is it easier to assume they were taken away from you rather than chose to leave? Something possessed them, something took them away.
Definitely makes certain things easier. I don't know what anyone's relationship with death is. My father passed away 2 years ago, and is heartbreaking, and is and as much as nobody ever wants anything like that to happen, it is much more easy to accept the fact that it was cancer that took the life away from him, as opposed to him making the decision, I don't want to be a part of this family anymore. Right.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting perspective. That's very interesting.
Erica goes on to say, also the film The Stuff is a great addition here. I've never heard of the film The Stuff. Are you familiar with it?
Stuff. It's about a food that eats you. Man, that goes way back, and mad props to Erica for bringing up a like way off the wall reference.
This is 1985.
Yeah, it's like a snack food that like it's addictive to eat, but it's also eating you at the same time. It's kind of cool.
Just brought it up. Hold on, let's have a look-see right here. The Stuff. A delicious, mysterious goo that oozes from the earth is marketed as the newest dessert sensation, but the tasty treat rots more than teeth when zombie-like snackers who only want to consume more of the strange substance at any cost begin infesting the world. What?
Yeah.
That's crazy. All right, now I feel like I need to watch this movie. And it looks like...
Yeah, it's...
Oh, go ahead.
Kind of an invasion of the body snatchers kind of idea,
It looks like there was a 2018 remake.
People possessed. Really?
No, sorry. Same title, completely different film, has absolutely nothing to do with what we were talking about. Yeah. Weird.
Well, There's only one, as far as I'm concerned.
The Stuff. Oh, now I want to go see that. Erica says, favorite non-horror film with strong horror flavor. Jurassic Park. Easy
Yeah,
peasy.
yeah. I will continually argue that the moment that the T-Rex breaks loose in that is not only one of the best frightening scenes, but the best action scene that's ever been put on film and may ever be put on film.
The build-up to it. The build-up is so iconic. You hear this low rumble of, and then you see the water go, and then you hear, and the way that they filmed that, I remember the story. That was the shot that they wanted to get, but they couldn't figure out how to get the water to jiggle without making the camera shake and without making the car shake. So what they did is they cut out a little hole in the cup holders where the cups of water were, and they put a guitar underneath the cups. So the cups were actually sitting on the back of a guitar, and they plucked the guitar strings, so the vibration of the guitar strings went up into the cup and shook the water, and that's how they got that effect. And it just blew my mind. Movie making magic, you guys.
Great scene. And the thing that Spielberg does better than anybody is he gives you somebody to care about, and then he puts those people in danger. And in that case, it's the kids. You know, they have that innocence to them. You don't care about the lawyer. It's a good thing that he gets eaten. But you know, when the kids are put in danger, it's somebody to rescue, somebody to care about. And Spielberg does this so well, you almost don't even see it.
Well, because you point out so brilliantly that, like, the rules of horror movies is that, like, whoever is being immoral is the one who dies. And the lawyer was only concerned with how much money is this park going to make. Like, he was brought to the island to, you know, as John Hammond says, to, you know, protect him from the idealists, essentially. And he was the one, it was the lawyer guy who wanted to make all the money, and it was his greed. That's what got him eaten, essentially.
Yes. Yeah.
Erica Sturgeon writes, I'm still afraid of Marshmallow Puff. Oh, the Stay Puffed Marshmallow Man. Ghostbusters. Classic.
Yeah. Giant monster too. Man in suit. I mean, you can't beat the man in suit. That's good stuff there too. I remember watching that in the theater, and you see his hat over the buildings, you know, before you know what he is, and you think, is this King Kong? You know, and what is this? Is this Godzilla? You know, and it comes up and it's the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. It's just wonderful. Yeah, that's brilliant.
So weird. It's such a weird choice too. Like, okay. And, you know, as a child, I didn't I couldn't wrap my mind around, because the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man is it was created for Ghostbusters. Like, that wasn't a thing in like social conscious, like that was not a product. So in my mind, I kept looking at the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man thinking, is that the Michelin Man? Because that was the only thing that I could associate with.
I think that's the idea. I think that was the idea initially, because that was the first thing I thought of too. But this big innocent baby character, you know,
so silly.
Yeah.
My cousin, Karen's husband, Chris, writes, the unsettling meta horror of realizing that you can't stop watching Videodrome as the protagonist can't stop watching the illegal cable channel. Woo, there's a fourth wall break for you.
Like adaptation level.
Whenever I think of Videodrome, I always get Videodrome and The Dead Zone confused, because it was around the same era. I know they're completely different movies, but for whatever reason, I get them like confused a little bit in my brain.
Right. Yeah.
Great films, though.
Well,
Great films. All right, guys. So that is our last comment of the day. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. Ron, thank you for coming out to the show and filling us with all of your knowledge and expertise. I would love to have you back and talk about more horror and also non-horror stuff in the future.
Sure, that would be.
But before we go, if I can find the right tile, because oh man, sorry you guys, this is a mess. How about this one? Nope, that one doesn't work. How about this one? Nope, that's both of us. Oh, hold on. I'll get there. I'll get there. There we go. Ron, tell us where, because you do movie reviews as well. So go ahead and plug your channel. Where can people find you online, and what projects do you have coming up in the near future?
You can find me on Ron Reviews on Facebook, which has been on an interesting hiatus since since the pandemic started, because I can't make it to movie theaters really, and I haven't had the opportunity. And then there are big movies I want to see that wind up getting pushed back. So usually I try to see movies before anybody else, and I throw out a review as soon as I can. I usually run right home from the movie theater, crank out a review, and I try to come at them from a unique angle, and I also don't do spoilers. And I only reviews movies I like. So if you were expecting me to be like another reviewer that would just trash a film he doesn't like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not interested in doing that, because I know there are movies that I like that other people hate, and there are movies that I hate that other people like. And I'm just, that's not an aspect of criticism that has any sort of interest to me. So I love movies. I want you to love movies too, and I want you to love the movies that I love. And if you don't, I want you at least to understand why I love them, and I hope I can relate that in an interesting way. So it's Ron Reviews on Facebook, and if you like and follow that, then you'll get the reviews as soon as they pop up, which is somewhat randomly as I watch movies that I enjoy. So,
well, again, Ron, thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to having you back on the show.
You bet, man. It's been a blast.
All right, guys, if you like this video, click like. If you really like this video, click subscribe. And if you really, really like this video, click share, because that is exactly what this dinosaur from Jurassic Park would want you to do. Roar, 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 roar. All right, enough silliness and ridiculousness. You guys, we live in a weird, crazy world where everybody has different thoughts and opinions and whatever. So I encourage everybody who's in the reach of my voice, if you have an opportunity to speak kind words to each other, please speak kind words to each other. If you have an opportunity to perform a random act of kindness, please take that opportunity and brighten somebody else's day. My name is Mike Brown. This is Gotta Love Them Movies. And ladies and gentlemen, I will see you tomorrow.